Sometime in the autumn of 1092, Nizam al-Mulk, the most powerful vizier in the Seljuk Empire, was traveling by litter between the cities of Isfahan and Baghdad. He had governed the empire for 3 decades. He had built universities, reformed taxation, commanded armies. He was, by any reasonable measure, the most indispensable man in the medieval Islamic world. Then a young man, disguised as a Sufi petitioner seeking alms, stepped through the curtains of the litter and drove a blade into his chest. The vizier died before nightfall. The assassin was captured, but under interrogation offered nothing beyond a single statement, that he served the old man of the mountain. What that phrase meant, and what it reveals about the hidden architecture of power that has shaped empires, dynasties, and civilizations throughout recorded history, is a question that official historiography has consistently failed to answer. Because the men who truly controlled those empires were almost never the ones whose names appeared in the records. The society responsible for the death of Nizam al-Mulk had been founded only 8 years earlier by a man named Hassan-i-Sabah, a theologian and military strategist who had seized an allegedly impregnable mountain fortress in northern Persia called Alamut, the Eagle's Nest, in 1090. What he built there defied every political category available to the medieval mind. It was not an army. It was not a kingdom. It was a precision instrument of political manipulation, using the credible threat of assassination to extract tribute, political concessions, and intelligence from powers 10 times its size. The Crusader states paid the assassins annual fees. The Abbasid Caliphate negotiated with them. Saladin, who unified the Muslim world against the Crusades, survived 2 assassination attempts and reportedly woke one morning to find a poisoned cake and a note on his pillow. A demonstration, not an execution. Hassan-i-Sabah died in his bed in 1124. His order survived for another century and a half. When the Mongols finally destroyed Alamut in 1256, their historians reported finding a library of such breadth and sophistication that the conquering general, Hulagu Khan, ordered its contents preserved rather than burned, an almost unprecedented act of restraint for a Mongol campaign. Those records have never been fully catalogued. What knowledge the assassins had accumulated, and who ultimately inherited it, remains one of the more aggressively unasked questions in medieval scholarship. Several centuries earlier, in the dense political atmosphere of post-Roman Gaul, a different kind of shadow institution was allegedly taking shape. The Merovingian dynasty, those long-haired Frankish kings who unified much of what is now France between the 5th and 8th centuries, produced a succession of rulers so peculiar in their behavior, so apparently guided by sources outside the visible court, that certain researchers have long argued they were operating under instruction. The Priory of Sion, if it existed as its proponents claim, was that instruction. In 1891, a village priest named Bérenger Saunière began renovating his church in the small southern French town of Rennes-le-Château. During restoration, he removed a stone altar pillar and found hollow tubes concealed inside it. Whatever parchments those tubes contained, and witnesses claimed to have seen them before Saunière sealed his study. He traveled immediately to Paris, met with officials at the Church of Saint-Sulpice, and returned transformed. Within a decade, he had spent the equivalent of several million modern dollars on construction projects, entertaining guests, and the acquisition of rare manuscripts, on a priest's annual salary of 500 francs. He never explained the source of his wealth. He died in 1917, reportedly whispering a confession so disturbing that the attending priest refused last rites. What Saunière found in that pillar has never been established with certainty, but the specific locations he visited in Paris and the specific figures he met suggest he had made contact with something older than the church he served. The Thuggee Brotherhood operated without concealment in plain sight, which made it more frightening than either of the previous examples. For roughly 600 years, from approximately the 13th century through the 1830s, this fraternal cult embedded itself in the caravans, trade networks, and local governance structures of the Indian subcontinent, strangling an estimated 2 million travelers in ritual sacrifice to the goddess Kali. What disturbed British colonial investigators most was not the scale of the killing. It was the institutional depth. Thuggee initiates occupied positions as caravan guards, local magistrates, and in some documented cases, minor administrative officials. They operated with the tacit awareness, if not the cooperation, of regional princes who found it useful to have an untraceable enforcement mechanism available. When the British East India Company launched its suppression campaign under William Sleeman in the 1830s, they discovered that the Brotherhood had informants inside the very police units conducting the investigation. The official narrative holds that the Thuggee were fully destroyed by 1870. Criminologists working in the region a generation later noted that the pattern of ritualized roadside deaths had not entirely ceased. It had simply become quieter. By the height of Chinese imperial anxiety in the late 19th century, the Qing dynasty was contending with a society whose influence had already penetrated the bureaucratic core of the state. The group that European observers called the Boxers were, before their rebellion became visible, something more precise and more dangerous. A network of initiated practitioners who understood their martial and spiritual disciplines as qualifications for governance, not merely combat. Their cells existed inside provincial military commands, inside tax collection offices, inside the networks of local magistrates who formed the empire's real administrative skeleton. The rebellion of 1900 was, according to certain historians, not a peasant uprising, but a faction within the state attempting to seize control from another faction. A civil war conducted partly in public and partly through channels that the official record was never designed to capture. After its suppression, the Qing court issued a formal decree dissolving the society. Researchers who have examined provincial records from the decade that followed note that the decree was complied with on paper and essentially ignored everywhere else. The Carbonari of early 19th century Italy represent perhaps the most elegant example of a secret society achieving and then voluntarily abandoning maximum influence. Organized around charcoal burner symbolism and structured in cells that maintained strict ignorance of other cells, they had, by 1820, placed members inside the governments of Naples, Piedmont, and the Papal States simultaneously. They coordinated the revolutions of 1820 and 1821 across multiple Italian states with a logistical precision that suggests centralized command, yet no central command has ever been identified. The Austrian Empire, which crushed those revolutions, captured hundreds of members and subjected them to extensive interrogation. The consistent finding: every Carbonaro knew his cell and nothing beyond it. By 1830, as the nationalist movements they had seeded began bearing fruit, the Carbonari as an organization had simply ceased to hold meetings. No dissolution, no schism, no manifesto of conclusion. The members who survived emigrated, joined other movements, or returned to ordinary life. The infrastructure they had built passed, apparently without friction, to successor organizations, as though the Carbonari had always understood themselves as scaffolding, not architecture. The Bavarian Illuminati are the most cited and least understood entry in a catalogue of secret societies. Founded on the 1st of May, 1776 by Adam Weishaupt, a professor of canon law at the University of Ingolstadt, the organization had recruited, within 9 years, an estimated 2,000 members across the courts and universities of Austria, France, Italy, Poland, and Hungary. Its internal documents, which survived because a courier carrying them was struck by lightning and the papers were seized by Bavarian authorities in 1785, reveal a society whose goal was not conspiracy for its own sake, but the systematic placement of rationalist reformers inside every institution capable of influencing governance. The Elector of Bavaria issued a suppression order in 1785. Every documented Illuminati member simultaneously disappeared from official correspondence. No trials, no public recantations, no paper trail of dissolution. Weishaupt himself fled to the court of a sympathetic duke in Gotha, where he lived to the age of 82, writing extensively about philosophy and saying nothing, for over 4 decades, about what he had built, who it had become, or where it had gone. Long before any of those organizations drew breath, a different kind of fraternal order was allegedly already ancient. The 9 unknown men are first described in Western sources by the journalist and novelist Talbot Mundy in 1923, but the tradition he drew from is considerably older, a thread running through Indian historical and philosophical writing, suggesting that the Mauryan emperor Ashoka, shattered by the carnage of his conquest of Kalinga in 268 BCE, convened a council of 9 scholars and charged them with the collection and suppression of 9 categories of knowledge deemed too dangerous for any civilization to deploy without destroying itself. Those 9 books, as the tradition describes them, covered propaganda and psychological warfare, physiology, microbiology, alchemy, communication, gravity, cosmology, light, and sociology. The Council's mandate was not to advance this knowledge, but to prevent it from being used. Some researchers who have examined Mauryan administrative records note anomalies in the way certain technical knowledge appears to have been deliberately compartmentalized across regions, as though someone had calculated that no single province should ever possess the complete picture. Whether that represents imperial policy or the operation of a hidden council is, of course, precisely the kind of question that cannot be answered. Which is, one might argue, exactly how such a council would have designed it. The Order of the Solar Temple is the entry on this list that should be most difficult to dismiss, because it is the most recent and the most thoroughly documented. And yet the documentation raises more questions than it answers. Founded in Geneva in 1984 by Luc Jouret and Joseph de Mambro, the order drew membership from prominent figures in Swiss banking, Quebec politics, and Belgian civil administration. Its theology was a hybrid of Templar mysticism and New Age cosmology, but its actual operations, documented in judicial proceedings across 3 countries, involved the movement of significant capital, the collection of intelligence on member institutions, and what several former members have described as structured blackmail. Between October 1994 and March 1997, 74 members died in fires and apparent mass suicides across Switzerland, Quebec, and France. Investigators in all 3 jurisdictions struggled to establish who gave orders, because the order's command structure, like the Carbonaries, was cellular and deliberately opaque. The Swiss federal investigation concluded in 2001 with findings that satisfied no one. Several key figures named in testimony had, by the time hearings concluded, relocated to jurisdictions without extradition arrangements. The fires are officially closed as cases. The finances have never been fully traced. Japanese intelligence files from the early 20th century contain references, oblique and carefully phrased, to a society known as the Green Dragon, Ryukai in some transliterations, described as an esoteric Buddhist order with roots in the late Edo period that had, over several generations, cultivated relationships inside the Meiji government's military and foreign policy apparatus. Western intelligence agencies, British, American, and Russian, each produced separate assessments of the society between 1905 and 1935. Assessments that agree on almost nothing except that the organization existed and that its membership list was distinct from, though overlapping with, the visible ultranationalist societies of the period. The most specific claim in these documents, that the Green Dragon influenced the decision to pursue expansion into Manchuria in 1931, has never been confirmed because the relevant Japanese military records from that period were selectively destroyed in August 1945 in the days between the Emperor's surrender broadcast and the arrival of Allied occupation forces. What was destroyed, and on whose instruction, is a question the official record describes as unanswerable. The oldest entry on this list predates writing itself, or rather, it predates most writing, appearing in fragments at the very edge of the written record's beginning. Sumerian clay tablets from approximately 3500 BCE contain references, in contexts that scholars have variously translated as mythological or administrative, to a priestly class described as guardians of the serpent's knowledge, a brotherhood holding exclusive control over astronomical observation, agricultural calendaring, and water management in a region where those 3 things constituted the entire basis of survival and power. The Brotherhood of the Snake, as later a cult tradition named them, allegedly maintained this monopoly not through violence but through the more durable mechanism of exclusive literacy. If you controlled who could read the tablets recording when to plant and when to expect floods, you controlled the food supply. If you controlled the food supply, you controlled the civilization. Archaeologists excavating administrative centers in the Fertile Crescent have repeatedly noted a peculiar consistency. Across cities that show no evidence of political connection, the structure of priestly record-keeping is functionally identical. Same symbols, same organizational hierarchies, same selective illiteracy among the general population. Coincidence of parallel development, mainstream archaeology suggests. The alternative explanation, that a single institution, operating across political boundaries for centuries, imposed that consistency, remains, like so much on this list, officially unexamined. Across more than 5,000 years and every inhabited continent, these 10 societies share a characteristic that has nothing to do with conspiracy and everything to do with design. They did not seek visibility, they sought leverage. Over information, over succession, over the channels through which power moves before it becomes power. Official history, by its nature, records what was visible: the throne, the general, the decree. It cannot easily record the meeting held 3 nights before the decree, in a room with no windows, attended by men whose names appear nowhere in the record that survives. What makes these accounts difficult to simply categorize as folklore is the consistency of their operational signatures. The cellular structure, the infiltration of administrative rather than military positions, the deliberate disappearance at moments of maximum apparent influence. Mainstream scholarship attributes that disappearance to suppression, to the natural entropy of secret organizations, to the fragility of anything built on concealment. But suppression leaves records. Entropy leaves fragments. These societies, almost without exception, left nothing, as though they had not been destroyed but had simply decided to stop being visible. The question that lingers, after surveying 5 millennia of shadow governance, is not whether such societies existed. It is whether any of them truly vanished, or whether vanishing was simply the next phase of the operation.